The March on Washington D.C. famously fills the waiting pool that is in between the Lincoln Memorial and what is now the World War II Memorial, or the Washington Monument. And this is where Martin Luther King Jr. famously makes his "I Have a Dream" speech. All right, outlining the ideas that we as Black Americans and white Americans can live together in harmony. That there doesn't have to be this divide. That one day his daughters will go to school with whites, and there won't be any pressures to separate the two races. So after JFK's assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes president, and there's a lot more sympathy towards Lyndon Baines Johnson pushing the civil rights movement bills forward because it was one of JFK's pet projects, and because he was assassinated, this takes America into an emotional state to kind of be more supportive. Plus, with Johnson, what you have is a Southern Democrat. You have a Southern white individual who is championing African American rights. So this gets a lot of, not a lot of Southerners, but a lot of whites on the side of, all right, maybe we've been looking at this the wrong way. So two laws that we're going to talk about in this chapter that are vital for you to remember for the regions. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which realistically extends the Brown v. Board of Education decision, which eliminated segregation in public schools. Now it's eliminated in all public entities. All right, so if something is publicly owned, meaning that it's open to the public, segregation is no longer allowed. So you got motels, restaurants, bathrooms, drinking fountains, etc. It also bans voter registration for blacks and whites that were different, meaning where and how you could register to vote. These were roadblocks, obviously set up for African Americans. That would really deter them from voting in the South mainly. And then discrimination based on race, religion, sex, all these things in terms of jobs was not allowed either, which is a very difficult thing to enforce and really to investigate. However, because it's written in there, it does help push everything forward, push the civil rights movement forward. So we're starting to see this change. So make sure you understand that 1964, that's a year that you definitely want to remember, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what it does. All right, realistically ends segregation in all public settings, as opposed to what the Brown v. Board decision only ended discrimination and segregation in public schools. So because voting rights barriers have been eliminated, you start to see more people trying to vote. While in the South, there's still hostility, of course, amongst white Southerners towards African Americans. So the SCLC proposes a protest, a march from Selma to Montgomery, when African Americans have been arrested arrested when they're in the lines to vote. So they march, and in doing so, the police are attacking these marchers until Lyndon Baines Johnson finally sends in the National Guard to protect them. So this is two instances in the 1950s and 60s where we start to see presidents take a more active role with not only African Americans, but their rights to peacefully protest. So you saw this with Dwight Eisenhower, with the Little Rock Nine, escorting them into school, and now Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is helping escort these marchers on their peaceful protests. So this is what we tend to refer to as chief executive power, or oh my gosh, I lost my thought. Or commander-in-chief power, as it's sometimes highlighted. Sorry about that pause there. So immediately after, we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So you have Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. All right. They're in alphabetical order, C before V. That's an easy way to remember 1964 and 1965. These are 2 years that will come up on your regions. They're good for you to remember for your essays. Just remember that this is about 100 years after the Civil War. Sometimes that's an easy way to remember. 1865, Civil War ends. 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is